So this week we have a teaching chat, and I'm really excited that all of you took time to be here. And we don't have a real agenda. I have questions that I want to ask, I have issues that I want to talk about, but this is a space where we really get to talk about anything kind of related to teaching, broadly defined, to kind of crowdsource and brainstorm ideas and those kinds of things. So I want to begin by kind of throwing out there if anyone has anything that they want to talk about.
I can start. In my class, I do breakout sessions like maybe once every 2 weeks. So it's normal. They've done this like three or four times now, and usually what I'll do is I'll go in, I'll give them a thing to discuss, and they need to write it down, and then we'll all talk about it as a group. And then I'll peek into different rooms, see how they have any questions. So this is like towards the end of the activity, and I see like everybody's mics are off and and their cameras are muted or whatever. I get the reverse. I'm just like, maybe they're done. So I was like, hey, like, what's going on? You all are discussing. And then one person unmutes and they're like, oh, nobody said anything. So I thought we weren't doing it. And so it's a thing they could do by themselves, but I explicitly said discuss it. So I don't know. I wasn't overly happy. So I mean, there's some credit I could not give, or partial credit I could not give. I don't know how I should approach it, but I don't know. It offended me a little bit, but I don't know if it should have.
So you had a breakout room and nobody played.
Yeah. I mean, this is everybody else. I mean, I went to probably 4 out of 8, and everybody else was talking. So it wasn't like the whole class is doing this, but I don't know.
So I've never had a breakout room where people didn't play. So I'm kind of wondering if other people have had this experience, and if you have, how you dealt with it.
So this is something that we experience not irregularly in the lower level language classrooms, that I think that a lot of it stems from just like insecurity, not really being excited about being there. Like a lot of the students are taking it for a requirement and aren't really excited that they feel like they have to take it. And so you end up with a good number of students that are just there like to check the box. And for some students, it's going to be really hard to engage them, and you just do the best you can. I've found that assigning roles to the students in the breakout rooms and having each student be responsible for a different aspect. So like have somebody be, is going to be the, what do you call it? Portavoz. Anybody speak Spanish? Like the speaker, responsible for, telling the class what they talked about in their group. Somebody's responsible for being like the secretary and writing everything down. Somebody's like the time manager, that keeps them like with what they need to be doing. So that having roles for what each student needs to do can be helpful. And also, which I think we've mentioned in this group a couple of times before, just like being really short with what they have, like the amount of time that they have and what they need to do. So if you think that something's going to, that they're going to need like 4 or 5 minutes to do something, give them 2 or 3 minutes and be like, okay, this is what you have to do, ready, go. And then as soon as they come back, like check in with each group immediately. So like, hey, so-and-so, I want to hear from you guys. What did you say? So that then there's like this pressure that if they don't do it, they're definitely going to get called out when they come back.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's anything inherently about me or the class, but I do tell them like we've done this before, so they know. So I do tell them, one, remember what your group number is, because I am going to call on groups and have like a designated speaker. But how I think this happened, and I think somebody in the chat asked if they knew like that they were going to discuss this, and the answer is yes. By the way they articulated it, what happened, it was like the bystander effect. Like nobody wanted to be the first one to turn on the camera or say, and if they would at least use the chat or something, I don't know. And I'm more of a talkative person, so this would never be an issue for me. So I don't know if there's I don't think this thing was super complicated, but at the very least,
But that's where I find that giving them roles helps, because if you have one student that's like designated as like, you're the leader, you're the one who's supposed to start, then like, it doesn't give that awkward, because that often happens even in this group, where we're all like motivated people. We don't have to be here. Sometimes when we go into the breakout rooms, there's kind of this like, okay, who's going to talk first? What are we going to talk about? And so like giving the students like a little more structure helps with that dynamic of like, okay, I want this person to be the leader. You're going to be the one who initiates, and sorts everything out. That can help. It doesn't necessarily make everything better, but
How do you assign those out? Like, you actually have their name to a role that you're showing to the whole class before you start?
that's a good question. Sometimes I do it that way. So I'll like break them out into groups. Sometimes I'll say like, alphabetically. So, first person by first name, so first person in the alphabet, you're going to be this. Second person in the alphabet, you're going to be this. Sometimes I have them choose. So it kind of depends on like how much time I want to dedicate. So sometimes I'll say like, you have a minute to figure out who's doing what. A lot of times when I'm doing an activity that's a little bit longer, I'll do it that way. And I'll give each of them a Google Doc to fill out. And at the top, it'll say, the different roles, and they'll have to fill in the names. So I've done it different ways. It kind of depends on what the activity is, how long they have to do it. But yeah, that part's a little bit more challenging because I like to just do the random assign rooms. And when I'm assigning roles, sometimes it can be more complicated, which is why I like the alphabetical one, because then it doesn't matter if there's somebody who didn't show up or anything like that.
Like, at a minimum, at least saying the person who's the facilitator is, alphabetically first, and at least then they can all look at each other and be like, okay, you're in charge.
Yeah, exactly. So like, oh, it's you.
So I want to point out just a couple of things that are occurring in the chat so that we have it as part of the recording when we go forward. So some people in the chat were wondering, maybe the instructions weren't necessarily clear when they get to the breakout rooms about what they were supposed to do. And people are sharing some really cool ideas about putting the instructions into the chat, having people take a screenshot of the instructions, maybe put it in a Google Doc so they have that with them when they're actually in the breakout room. Because I will also admit that sometimes, at some of our events, we'll get a long list of things to do in a breakout room. And after we do the first two, like, I don't remember any beyond those first couple. So making sure that they know what they're supposed to do is going to be helpful there too. Slava, you made a really nice analogy to the bystander effect, where people have this diffusion of responsibility and therefore don't help. And we know the way to get around the bystander effect is to personalize the helpers. This is exactly what our colleagues are suggesting, is that you're kind of taking that decision out of their hands and saying, you're going to do this. One of the other things you can do is have more than one role in the groups. So if you have groups of 3, for instance, you could have 3 different roles in the groups that they're going to play. The first person is going to give you the first thing they came up with, the second person is going to give you the second thing, the third person is going to give you the third thing, for instance. So I think there are ways that you can kind of do this, but that urgency we kind of talked about, that Andie had talked about at the early part, giving them a little bit less time is another way to kind of keep them on task. And I think I got most of the stuff in the chat, but if I missed your comment, now is the time to make sure it gets out there.
Yeah, sorry, Stuart, go ahead.
Okay, so I just wanted to kind of follow up with the Google Docs. I really love watching students work, and then I know when they're done. So sometimes I'd say, you'll have 10 minutes for this breakout room, and it's way too much time. Or sometimes I'll say you have 10 minutes and it's not enough time. But if I give them something to do on a Google Doc and they're filling it out, I can see when they're done. I just did an unstructured breakout room yesterday for an exam review, and it's kind of unstructured because I gave them a list of topics in a Google Doc, and I said, I gave them things to do, like explain the thing that you're most confident in, identify a muddy point. Now, other people try to explain that muddy point to the other student, and then come up with things that we might want to review. But I had them come up with the things they want to review in the Google Doc, and then I just was typing answers right there. While they were typing questions in the Google Doc, I was typing examples and answers. We had a conversation going. One student decided to bold all of my answers while I was doing them to help me out so that they would stand out better. And they actually enjoyed it. And I think it was a really productive way. They still have that Google Doc with the answers to their questions too.
I have one of our grad students here, actually. I was observing her class, and we wrote this up in our K-State Spanish blog recently, that she uses Google Forms and has the students like answer questions. So then you can have like multiple choice questions, you can include images, you can have all this stuff. And the really cool thing about that is, one, you get to see like the answers rolling in. So they click submit, and in real time, you get an idea of like when students are mostly done. And then on top of that, once they come back, you can pop up the graphs. So it shows, like, if it's something that's a multiple choice question, you can graphically show and share your screen and say, like, so this is what most people think, and this is what, you know, like, this is how most of you responded to this. Like, let's talk about that. And I thought that that was just such a cool way to, you know, make sure that you're kind of tracking, like, okay, everybody's about done now because I've gotten a bunch of responses. And then also be able to, like, easily show what everybody talked about and kind of where, you know, if it's an opinion thing, what their opinions are on something. I thought it was a really, really cool use of technology that's simple, but really easy to use in the breakout rooms.
Is it fairly intuitive to set those up?
Yeah, they're really easy. So if you just go to Google Forms, it walks you through it.
Excellent. Any other input for Slava and the breakout rooms, or any other kind of breakout room strategies that have worked for people well?
I was going to chime in and say you can send a message to the breakout rooms. It's very small. It doesn't really grab your attention, but if they're looking for it, if they're used to it, they'll probably see it. But it's not the greatest tool, I don't think, in Zoom. And I do think that the chat will stay in your chat window, but then your breakout room chat doesn't get shared. Like, that's just within your group, but you keep what you have. But yeah, right before you go out into the breakout room, it'd be nice to post that again in case anybody was late. Or sometimes, you know, I've been guilty of this. I'll switch devices and then, oh my gosh, my chat's gone and I don't know where I'm going, that kind of thing. So do it before and often, probably.
So Tucker just sent me off to a breakout room, and I can confirm I could still see all the chat from previously. So that's good. I didn't realize that. That's very helpful.
I had asked a question in the chat about whether the students knew, like, say ahead of class, before class, whether they were going to be answering questions in a breakout room or discussing things in a breakout room. And for me personally, as a student or a participant, it's kind of an introvert extrovert thing. So if in the middle of class you say, okay, we're going to discuss this topic and go in a breakout room, I need a little more time to process and think about what I think about the topic and then what I'm going to say about it. And so just going in a breakout room and having 3 or 4 minutes for 4 people to discuss something, I haven't even had a time to digest what I'm thinking, let alone how I'm going to talk about it with other people. And then to go in a breakout room and have that pressure to perform in front of classmates just adds to it. And so maybe that would cause people to kind of disengage a little bit. I don't know, that could be just one explanation, but if they knew prior to class, hey, these are the topics we're going to discuss, and here's some questions I might ask, and so come to class prepared to go into breakout rooms and talk about these things, might give us introverts a little more time to kind of plan what we're going to think about and what we're going to say. Just a thought.
So in the chat, people are saying that they agree with all of the points that you're raising, and are saying that when they've had, you know, breakout room start, people log out immediately. I can empathize with the point when you go to a presentation and didn't expect it to be a breakout room. And, you know, I had one where I was making lunch. I was literally cooking. I was like, I can't do the breakout room now, leave, you know, kind of thing. In my classes, the ones that I use breakout rooms heavily in, like my principal's college teaching class, for instance, the first SLO is get ready to use your voice, you know, kind of thing, because that's something that needs to be part of every class. You're going to have some opportunity to interact. So it's part of what I'm training my students to do in that class, because in teaching, when someone asks you a question, you've got to kind of answer on the fly. So we're kind of training people to get ready for that. But I absolutely agree, in undergraduate classes, especially the larger classes for students who are, you know, maybe not as well skilled at being college students, it can be very, very daunting. And we've talked about the individual differences and personality factors that might play into that. So I don't do it as much in my lower level classes. I'm kind of wondering if anyone has, with some success, kind of talk about how they deal with these very serious issues.
Well, one thing I'm wondering if this might be helpful, especially for introverts, to give them a little bit of time, is I've told my students when they go in their breakout rooms, introduce yourselves first and have a little small talk first for a minute or two, then start working on the assignment. So that way they're getting the benefit of the work. The breakout room is a way to meet other students like they would in small groups in class. And I think that's really helped some students get to know one another and know other students in the class. So when they have questions, or when they see them in a breakout room in the future, again, they're a little more comfortable than they would have just jumping right into working in the breakout room.
I'm experimenting with one of my classes that we have case studies we do once a week, and we usually do them on Wednesdays. And we're in the habit that will always be breakout rooms. But I've been trying for the first half of the semester that they've got assigned groups. So they're in the same small group the whole time, that I'm hoping will help them to be a bit more comfortable with that group, maybe be a little bit more vulnerable. I haven't got feedback on it yet, but that's one thing I'm trying. That I told them I'd mix up the groups kind of halfway through the semester to give them a chance to interact with other people in the class.
I definitely agree with the icebreaker small group time. And I'll usually give my students, I teach mostly first years, I'll give them a question to answer, so that if they feel awkward just randomly sharing information about themselves, I'll say, if it's October, I'll say, tell me something you like about fall, or if you celebrate Halloween, or your favorite costume. So I'll give them that for the students that aren't super comfortable, and then they have something to talk about. I've also had good luck with breakout rooms if it's after an assignment they've worked on together as a group. So for my class, they workshop their papers together. So they're usually in a group of 3, and they email each other, or I help them email each other their papers. They give feedback, and then the next class period, we have a breakout room where they talk about their comments. So they've already read and commented on their classmates' papers, and so this gives them a chance to ask for more feedback, ask for clarifications, add tone of voice, or say, oh, I can't read your handwriting here, although they're usually typed. But if they have a really specific purpose that's related to an assignment, they found that to be pretty valuable, and I often ask for more time because it's something they're getting a grade on. So, and then they've already interacted with their peers too.
Brandon, I was going to say that when we first started the online courses of the spring a year ago, I immediately took my students from my studio, and I think it works the same way with laboratories or places where students have the same assigned seat all the time. And I broke them out according to their grouping in those studios. So they had been used to talking to each other all the time. And it made the same, almost like a simulation of what would happen in class if we had been in class. This year, I tried breaking them out randomly just to see if there's a difference. And I have found there is a difference, that even though they're all in the same class, and the randomness means they're not always with the same group, they're less likely to work together. Because I come in, I peep in those breakouts and see what they're doing. And a lot of times they're not working together. And I'll say, oh, are you all done like assessing each other already? And they're like, well, no, only one person had anything to show. I'm like, okay. So I am finding that if you have, and I know faculty in you all situation probably don't assign seats in the larger classrooms. You don't do that. The students come in and sit whatever they want. But if they've been in those groups, as I sort of heard Melissa talk about in terms of research, it does work better in their breakouts.
I think also in cases where you can give students in each group like something slightly different to work on, that can be helpful too. So I'll do that sometimes where like we're talking about a topic, and I'll give, recently I did this where each student had an artistic representation of a historical moment in Latin America related to like the similar time period, but each of them had to talk about a different artwork and then come back to class and tell what they had discussed. And so giving, and it can even be like, having them just take a different perspective in their group, social perspective or whatever your topic is, that if you give each group something slightly different, there's a little bit more motivation there to really get in it, because you're not coming back and all discussing the exact same thing. Everybody has to bring something new to the discussion afterwards.
I think it's a great idea, Andie. I think I do a lot of my breakout rooms kind of on the fly. So I don't know that I have the ability to think of like 5 good questions versus 1 good question to ask people, but with some intention, I think that I could probably work that in, and I like that. Again, I want to kind of just point out some great thoughts that are happening in the chat. Stu mentioned that it's important that our students understand why we're doing breakout rooms in the first place. And I know in talking to undergraduates, they don't always know why. Like, they just stuck us in the breakout rooms again. But letting them know how that's enhancing their learning, how it's improving their critical thinking, they're dealing with and applying the information, I think is going to be really helpful. And then Jason had a great question about maybe doing some kind of speed intro sessions, kind of speed dating in the early part of the semester to create some community and some affiliation with students as they go through the semester, so that when they're in those breakout rooms, they've already done some of that acquainting. And in a small class, you might not have to do that very often before they get comfortable with each other. In a larger class, you may still want to have some of that acquaintance stuff kind of going on. In one of my classes, we did some mid-semester feedback, and one of the feedback that I got, and in that class, it's about teaching. I tell them why we do the breakout rooms we do. I have that kind of urgency, the quick question stuff. And they're like, but then we don't get to acquaint. And I think that was kind of neat feedback. So one of the things that I'm trying to do is trying to find ways to use the breakout rooms with them acquainting as one of the SLOs during the breakout session, along with another one that would go along with that. Because I don't want to get them to a point where they've all kind of shared their favorite color or their favorite food, and now they go dark and don't engage in the activity anymore. But I really like where this is kind of going and helping me think about what I'm going to be doing in my stuff going forward. And while I was talking, like 5 more messages came in, so I'm gonna check out what's going on in there, and let other people share what they think about breakout rooms.
Don, I wanna say something about this in general. That I've used speed dating at conferences because I hate for people to sit at a table or listen to a lecture and that's all they do in the session. So when I go to conferences, I'm encouraging, if I'm in a position to help plan that conference, that they look at speed dating as a way to, first of all, get some exercise, get up and move around and do some other things, but also to learn from different groups in the room. And I find that if we think about our experiences at conferences, and especially conferences online, then we can reflect on what works for us and what doesn't work for us, so that we can better prepare our students for that, because they're just like us. I mean, we experience a lot of those things that we're talking about. I also want to bring up role playing. And I'd really like some feedback about this, because we did a session about 4 years ago where our students, all of our landscape architecture and planning students, so over 100 students, were doing a whole day and a half of design, what we call design day. And we asked them all in groups, which we assigned according to their discipline and years, so that we had representation in each group, to do some role playing. And they all understood the roles. You know, you're the, the manager of a city, you're a professional landscape architect. We gave them roles that we knew they'd understand. And I was sort of responsible for kicking them off by demonstrating role playing. And I played this 16-year-old kid who's, doing this lecture about why it's important to understand points of view. And so as we went around looking in our groups and looking at the solutions that they produced, we realized they didn't quite role play. They ended up reverting back in some cases to all being students in a room. And so I'm curious about how people really make that a successful experience.
And LB, I think that's a great question. I think role play is hard. I don't role play well. It's not something that I love to do. It's not something that I feel authentic in doing, and authenticity is a big part of who I am as a teacher, or try to be as a teacher. So it's not something I ask my students to do very often. One of the things, and I think a couple of us have mentioned it, is it's important to consider our own experiences. If we wouldn't like doing it as a student, why would we ask our students to? If we're not going to see it as valuable, why would we do that? So we should be the teacher we would want to learn from. Role playing isn't something that I especially find helpful for me as a learner. I find it to be very insincere, disingenuous, and oftentimes stereotypic. A lot of times what people do is they use their preconceptions and exaggerate a caricature of someone else. And I don't want to be teaching them to do that. So I'm very ambivalent about role play. I'm not saying it doesn't work in other people's classes, but in a social psych class, when we teach about things like stereotyping and prejudice, role play can be very dangerous in what is happening in that class. So I'm going to invite other people to share very different thoughts from my own on role play, because I haven't found it to be very successful for me.
I also
Go ahead, Andie.
I was going to say, I also tend to avoid role playing because it's also not something that I particularly enjoy, but I do something kind of like role play adjacent, which is giving students different perspectives to look at one issue. So that, you know, like imagine that they're a small business owner. Like I've done this when talking about immigration on the southern border. So like that, you know, somebody's a small business owner on the side of the border. You know, somebody else is working in, you know, some other capacity, and giving them like a bunch of different perspectives to think about the issue of immigration from. And I think that, you know, then they're not putting themselves in the role of somebody who they're not, but they're having to think of what it's like to be in somebody else's shoes and think about like, okay, what are the things that they would think about? And I find that gives kind of a similar feel that role play is going for, without asking them to pretend to be somebody that they're not.
Yeah, we did that in a way, Andie. We gave them a synopsis of what that person was, what their position was in the role-playing mode, and we explained to them, and we had another speaker who talked a lot about the way to use role-playing. So we gave them a lot of intro, and we said, this is a way for you to understand different people's points of view in the planning design process, and that you need to be aware that a mayor or someone on the planning commission is going to take a different point of view about something. And so we gave them, you know, positions like, this is a typical farmer who lives right next to this property, so that you could really sort of get into that role. But and they did for a short period, but shortly when it came to then designing, they lost track of the roles. They reverted back to, oh yeah, I agree with you, rather than being the combative person that they were intended to be. So they dropped out of their roles. And it was an interesting observation for me. And we're talking about over 120 students. So it's a lot of groups in different studios to manage. But I was just curious to know how anyone else had been successful at it.
One of the things I will say is that the way that I define role play as being someone you're not, I often do like people to tell me what they would do in a situation as themselves. And in that kind of situation, I don't see them playing a role. So I often say, as an instructor in a class, this happens, what would you do to alleviate the situation? I'm not asking you to answer as someone else. And that's how I kind of think about role play. So I've had success with that. You know, being yourself, what would you do in this situation? What do you predict would happen in the situation? I love to have my students think, if you were a participant in the study I'm telling you about, how would you have responded on the dependent measures? So I think having them kind of metacognitively anticipate their own behaviors and reactions is a good thing. And I've had success doing that. It's not much different from role play, but I think it gets me to some of the same kinds of places.
I think when you're trying to train individuals in professional programs to understand the responsibility of their professional roles when they graduate, is a great, what you're talking about is what I do with my community development students with every final project that they do. They're asked to analyze that situation, that project, and say, if you were the planner here in that city, given these parameters, these issues, what would your solution be? Or how does the city now change their direction to make it a successful project? And that works very well. And it is in a way a role play, but it's not a direct, you know, in costume role. Yeah, I agree.
There's a really cool theme that developed in the chat where someone had noted, I think it was Cheryl noted, we're talking about talking. And there's a lot of ways that we can kind of express our learning and our engagement other than talking. Melissa made the point that talking is one way to engage, and an important one, especially in many of our classes. I think there are other ways that we can get our students to engage and interact with the material. I had offered the opportunity of giving weekly reflections. And then Jason mentioned that there's actually some really cool research that showed that reflection assignments, where students kind of think about the information and apply it to their lives, maybe ask questions about it, is a really good way to deepen learning, and is correlated with lots of cool things in the research that Jason has done. So I'm wondering about the other ways, besides kind of getting them to engage in a chat and getting those to talk in class. that we can get them to deepen their understanding. Because I will say that I would love my students to talk more in my classes, but the ones who aren't talking aren't necessarily disengaged. So I want to find ways that don't necessarily put a ton of work on my plate, because a lot of the solutions that we come up with create more work for us. And I think, you've heard me talk about the empathetic course design perspective. We have to be empathetic to our students, but also to us. And every assignment we give them will come back. So I'm wondering about kind of empathetic assignments that we can use to get our students to demonstrate their learning, maybe that they picked up from a class conversation, but didn't necessarily feel comfortable or were unable to use their voices. Because there are real reasons to have those videos off. There are real reasons to be able to unmute. And I'm trying to be very sensitive to those. So I'll kind of leave my question there about other ways that we can get our students to show and demonstrate their learning and to engage without actually using their voice in the moment.
I'll give you an example. This is my pop culture planning course that we run that's very visual. It's about film. It's about video. So I took a film that was divided into chapters. So it looked like you were going to a play, but you were hearing it as someone was reading an audiobook. That's the way the film is set up. And instead of us talking about it, I said, everybody gets a certain size sheet and create a collage for the chapter that you most were interested in. So they had to create a visual in a couple of days of what they thought that chapter was about. And we just pinned them up. And actually the way I did is I assigned them, I just put the chapters up and said, pick a chapter that you want to visually represent. And I don't care how you represent it. And then we put them all together as if we were looking at the whole film and said, do these images, whatever they were, whether you drew them, cut them out of a magazine, however you did it, do they represent the story? And can we understand the story from what you did? And it's one of my favorite things, because these are students, obviously, who have graphic or visual communication. So, but they all chose different ways to communicate it. There were no parameters there. And I still have the plates because I thought they were fun and interesting, and different people dealt with it totally differently. So that's a nonverbal way to do it. And it could be word all. If you're not very visual, you can do it in a lot of different ways. You could use color and just say, black. That if I put up a black screen, that means something about what I felt or my response to that section. So you could use colors association. I can think of other ways that we do it in our college. Just present a visual, a film or a video, a song. Things that are a medium that don't need the student to react except to respond with a product.
So I'm gonna ask a question about that, because we've allowed in several of my classes, creative ways for students to demonstrate their learning. I've sometimes found that the students put more energy into the creative piece and less into the demonstrating of learning. And Tucker and I had a situation, last semester where students spent hours and hours and hours and hours and hours making a quilt to demonstrate their learning in the principles of college teaching. And for the life of me, I have no idea how they demonstrated anything they learned in our class. And it's really, it's hard to say, I don't get how it fits at all. And the student's like, well, I put all this work in, but it didn't fit. So how do you kind of keep students focused on the right thing in a creative endeavor?
Okay, here's the thing. Not every, it's like verbal visual communication. Not all of us use that method to communicate. All of us use the same vocabulary. So first of all, you have to analyze it properly. That's the first thing. So you had to write something with it, with the visual that says, I understand what was going on in the chapter. Okay. It didn't have to be a big essay or anything. It just may have been a few words that describe what you thought was going on there. That's number one. Number two, leaving the student, again, let me go back. I keep saying that learning is their responsibility. I am there as a tool to help them learn. We are there as faculty to educate students, but they also have to be self-educating. So I ask my students to find the medium that they feel the most comfortable, if it's visual, to communicate. But I give them a limit of time about how much energy, because effort doesn't count. It's the content I'm looking at, not the amount of time you took or the effort. Effort is not part of the equation. So with our students, they're certainly trained to do visual communication, first of all. Not everybody on campus would use that form, but I will find certain students won't do a pictorial example. They will do a word or another form of visual communication, regardless of what you consider visual. It's something that they understand, and they may be asked to explain it. So that means that there's another level of communication that explains why they've learned something out of that. And your feedback is part of their learning. So if you say to them, I understand that you chose this color for this to represent a certain emotion, explain that to me. And you may, through color theory, say, but there's another choice you could have made here that scientists have shown evoke a certain emotion. And I understand from your culture, that color may have been the best choice, but you're giving them feedback. So there's where the learning happens, that you're critiquing it. And you're also being empathetic that their culture or their background or something that they're going to tell you explains why. Mm-hmm. That's the key to that. It's not just what they did, it's what you do with what they did. Mm-hmm. That matters.
I appreciate that context. That makes it a lot easier. Andie's hand is up. Go ahead, Andie.
There we go. Yeah, so just I think that, you know, our feedback is really important, but one of the things that I've done this semester that I found to be really successful is one, having students give input as to how to design the rubric. For, you know, my students' first assignment this semester, I said, so like, this is what I'm having you do. I want you to talk in small groups, you know, briefly about like what is important. Like, here are some of the things that I think are important. Do you agree? Is there anything that you would take off this list? Is there anything you would add to it? And what kind of weighting would you give to it? And I gave them just, you know, 2 or 3 minutes of class time to kind of discuss their ideas. And then I sent out a survey, a Qualtrics survey, with how much they wanted each of those things to be weighted, and if there was anything that they wanted to add or drop from the grade. And then I made the rubric just from the averages in the percentages from the survey that they sent me. I said, this rubric is based on what you guys decided each thing should be worth. And so they were aware going in what each aspect of the project was going to be worth and how to dedicate their time. And then after they turned it in, I had them do an assignment where they learned about good ways to give feedback, and that it's important to be really specific and give concrete examples of why this is good or why this is bad, rather than just saying like, excellent job. Like, that doesn't really, like, okay. And so I used it as an opportunity to teach them about how to give feedback to themselves and others. And then I had them grade their own assignment based on the rubric that we created, and giving really detailed feedback for each of their, you know, why did you give yourself this rating for this category? And then use that to say like, you know, yeah, I agree. I think that you made a good argument for why you think that you deserve this, or, you know, this isn't really convincing. You're not giving me, you know, this isn't exactly what I'm looking for, but it gives them an opportunity to self-assess and see what they're doing well. And a lot of times they're really accurate. A lot of times they see like, ooh, this is something I'm good at. This is something I'm not so good at. And so I think that it's a good learning opportunity for them. And it's also a really important skill for them to have moving forward into their professional lives, to be able to really think critically about work that they're doing or work that other people are doing. So that's what I have done to help with that. You know, in a case like that, I would say like, what do you think you deserve and why? And if they could give me a good, like, this is why I, you know, deserve this, this is why this quilt shows what I'm working on, then I'd say, great. But if not, then it seems like, this was a cool idea that you didn't fully connect to the class.
And I think so first of all, the student couldn't articulate, how it fit the connection to our assignments. And we were very clear about, the rubrics and how things were set up. So I think it's just a case where a student just had some mission creep. And it was unfortunate that she had put a lot of time into something that was amazing. It just didn't, fit what we wanted. And we were pretty clear about setting that out there. Actually, one of the things that I do in that class, and I actually just made the semester video for this, is to make a video, how to rock the semester project. And didn't do the things we said you should do to rock the semester project. I do want to follow up with something that you said in there, Andie, too, and I love the empowerment in this. Having the students kind of create the rubric. Is there a situation where you would not have accepted what they created?
I have had a situation before where students, recently we did this, where they created the rubric, and one of the options on the rubric was that they find reliable sources. And the students had given this, so this is for, they had to create a report, and they gave this option quite the lowest of all the other things. So it was really relatively low ranking. And I was just like, well, you can't write an authoritative report on something without good sources. And so in that case, I always do the rubrics a good week or so before we have the assignment, and then I bring it back to the class and say, this is what you came up with. And I take those opportunities when I think that it's not quite right, to say why I think it's not quite right, talk to them about it for a few minutes in class, and ask if it would be okay if I give it some more weight, given that blah, 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 blah. They don't have a problem with it typically. There is the power dynamic that I don't really like, that I'm the professor, so they don't usually quibble about it, but
I like that as a fallback. I mean, I'm always kind of, because I was the highly intelligent slacker, and if you had said, okay, this is how we can divide up the points, I'd be the one saying, let's make it 100% formatting, because we can make sure it fits in 3 pages. We all get A's on this thing. Let's do this together. I would be the person who organized that revolt. So I'm very sensitive to that person potentially being in my class, kind of karmically, that I would have to deal with that person. So I like the kind of way that you have the ability to kind of tweak it with some debriefing of your students. At this point, I'll make a tangential comment, but then we'll come back. Now's the time where you might do some mid-semester feedback and kind of collect some of that feedback from your students. And Tucker's going to drop the link in, that my thoughts about things we can do at mid-semester and one of our Engage the Stage videos. We did this in one of my classes recently, and sometimes people give you feedback for your classes I don't want to have tests anymore. You say, well, we're going to have tests, and I think it becomes an opportunity, like Andie just talked about, where if students are suggesting something different, but it's really important to your class, that provides a learning moment for you to let them know more explicitly, intentionally, why it's important that's part of your class, why it's important to have reliable sources in the assignment. And it creates that conversation to get everybody back on the same page. So when you get feedback from students, I don't think you should ever just chase the feedback and try to make everyone happy, because you won't. But what you can do is take that as information, and it might be information that there was an important thing that you didn't make clear enough, and let students know why that's the case. There's also a case you might get opponent feedback. One student really wants this, one student really wants this, and those are mutually exclusive. You can say, I'm going with this for this reason. So I just wanted to make that point too. There's a couple pieces in the chat that are kind of coming up here that are really cool. And one of the things that Brandon said, and I use this in my classes as well, so of course I love the idea, is kind of at the end as an exit ticket, because there's really not much grading or time involved. You just ask, what's the most important thing you learned today? And what I really love about that is you don't have to necessarily grade. If you could, it'd just be participation points, it'd be effort points, which I think we should have classes with some effort points in there. But it's such a great way to leave your class saying, I learned something today. And it's so fulfilling as a teacher to say, wow, my students learned things today. And oftentimes it's not the things you expected. It might be something more personal and more reflective than just the we learned aggression is this definition. And it's really kind of a cool thing. It takes almost no time. I do it in lots of my classes. I don't usually have points associated with them, but I think it's a really good way to close class. We're done the 50 minutes, but we accomplished something today. And it's a really good way to get students to engage without having to use their voice, at least spokenly. They're writing it. But if they know they're going to do this often, they're kind of prepared for that. Cheryl's point earlier, did they know there was going to be a breakout room today? After about a week, my students know there's the possibility at the end, I'm going to have to tell this guy, what did I learn today? And they're better prepared to do that. So setting those norms, I think, is helpful. So I missed it too. Eva asked, all right, we do these kinds of things. We're providing feedback. Feedback is so important. What if we got a big class? How do we provide that feedback in a useful way, in a timely way, in a way that's going to help them out?
I can give you my 2 cents, although I do not have a 100-person class. Sometimes I will, if it's a really important assignment, like if it's leading up to the final paper, I will take the grading and I will make sure that feedback is given, but I'm not doing that every week because it's very time intensive. Other times it'll be like maybe you take a subset of the class and focus on giving feedback to a subset, and then you change which subset it is for the following week so that you rotate through giving everyone feedback. But again, it's not all 100 students every single week on every single assignment.
I find that aggregate feedback can be good too. So a lot of times if I have an assignment and I'm seeing like the same kinds of issues popping up over and over, a lot of times in the class after my students have turned in an assignment, I'll come to class and say, so I want to remind you guys, like, these are the important things about this assignment. Here are some of the things that a lot of you missed, and that I want to make sure that you understand, or, that we address now. And that way, rather than going through and giving detailed feedback in, I also don't have classes with 100 students, but classes with 20, 25, rather than going through and giving the same feedback to 20 different students, to just do it at the beginning of class.
I love that idea of rotating through as well. Thank you. And I think that kind of speaks to a little bit about, we have to assess students' learning, but it's okay if we don't assess everything they learn, and it's impossible to assess everything they learn. So there's a lot of learning that occurs that we may not be assessing, but it's still happening. So anytime we have them do partner work or small group work, depending on if it's breakout room or in person, we can assess a little bit, but there's still that learning experience happening. And I think that going back to the original question of how do we get students to engage without requiring them to use their voices, I think there's also a good group of students that might not be comfortable using their voices in a whole class setting, but if it's a partner or 2 other people, they are. And I've had this happen where I have some students that are just, they have really insightful thoughts that I've seen in their work, and I want for their classmates to see that as well. And so if they do that small group or their partner work, that gives them a chance to share that understanding and knowledge with their classmates, and not just listen, but to share that. And then I've had good luck with, when I do something like that, then calling on pairs or groups and saying, okay, Trina and Brandon, what's something that the 2 of you talked about? And then those Trina and Brandon can talk about their own idea or their partner's idea. So it can also be really validating for a student who's shy or lacking confidence but has great ideas, that their partner thought enough of their idea to say, well, I want to share what my partner said, with permission, of course. So that's something that's worked really well, and it gives those students a chance who are just quieter or shy to still use their voice in a way they feel more comfortable.
I love that idea, Melissa. It's so much less threatening, but they still have the opportunity to make their points and develop their voice in that safe setting. I love that idea. Jason in the chat is talking about how we can use maybe games and experiments with our students in groups to learn over the course of a semester. It can be something that we kind of embed in our class, something they get comfortable with, something we can guide them through. And it's more fun to kind of have that social connection in the learning and those kinds of things. I think I've said it before, I've struggled with group work myself, both as a student and as an instructor. And one of the things that I really like about group work when I use it in my classes is I have a point where they then become independent. So early on, there's the opportunity for peer review, there's the opportunity to share ideas, give each other feedback, maybe even develop similar methods, maybe even do a similar lit search. But there's a point where they become independent and prepare their own report or their own presentation or those kinds of things. And that's just something that I've kind of developed for myself. And what we've all got to do as teachers is kind of find out, we know what's going to work for us. I say this all the time in my class in college teaching is at these things, we're not giving you doctrine. We're not giving you rules. We're making suggestions and recommendations to each other. And if it works, that great. If it doesn't work for your class, if it doesn't work for your teaching persona, your teaching philosophy, your teaching practice, then don't do it. So just kind of, and you don't need me to give you that permission, but I know that some people just feel a little bit more validated to say, if you said, yeah, I'm never going to do that, that's completely, totally fine. We're trying to develop our own unique teaching identities here.
I think the other thing about that, Don, is that I hear that from students, from different faculty members, where they've sort of adopted a process of learning, and the teacher will have the new teacher will have a different way that they want them to learn. And they'll get frustrated because they're like, well, I already have a way, or I know how I want to do mine. Why do I have to listen to this faculty member? And my answer is always that we're here to give you options. We're here to share different strategies. You can learn something from that instructor, even if it's not the way you want to do it, but here's another way to think about it. And maybe there's some part of it that you will incorporate. So don't feel like this is worthless. And I think that's a thing that we will see as our students move through our curriculum, that they get to a point, third, fourth year, that they think they know everything, and they don't, and we don't either. But as they move from one class to the next and they hear a different strategy, it's like, I don't have to listen to this because I've already been out on internship and I know how it works, So I think that we have to also figure out how, especially with our seniors, to say, look, you might have had that experience, but there's still a lot to learn.
Absolutely. Very well said. So we're almost out of time. I want to make a couple of announcements. In the meantime, I'm just pulling up our list of events so I can announce what's happening next week really quickly. All right. So our meeting next week is going to be a very exciting one. It's meeting student needs, trauma-informed pedagogy and community building. Missy Farmer and Rachel Levitt will be giving that conversation. I'm really excited to be part of that next week. So it's going to be awesome. And unfortunately, it's very important. This is not kind of optional understanding of teaching our students where they are as they're dealing with very difficult things. So I really look forward to kind of seeing you next week. I also want to make a plug, and then we can return to any conversation that we want to have. I want to make a plug for our Teachers Telling Stories video series, which is coming up. If you know someone who tells a story in their teaching, about their teaching, whatever, and it's awesome, then we want them in the video series. If you are that person, then we want you in our video series. So just contact me and I'd be happy to give you the information about that. And if you want to make a nomination and you want me to contact someone, I can absolutely do that. But we're putting up these couple minute videos. We'll put out as many as we have. It's not like it's going to be the top 10 or any of those kind of things, but we just want to kind of have these teaching stories that personalize us, maybe make us feel good, extra points if they're funny, kind of thing as we move forward. So we're putting this video series together. And if you know people who would be part of it or want to be part of it yourself, we would love to have you. Stu is asking if we have any need to know events coming up. I'm going to ask Tucker if we have any need to know events coming up.
Let me pull up my schedule really quick.
I would argue that everything that the center offers is need to know, but that's just my point of view.
I will also take this opportunity to plug the reason Stu is asking about need to know is we give certificates at the Teaching and Learning Center for professional development, both for GTAs and for instructors. We have the information for that available online. I'm going to ask Ashley to throw that link in the chat if you're interested in that. We also, identify fellows for the Teaching and Learning Center. The way that I think about it is getting the professional development certificate, that's improving your own teaching. The fellowship, that is basically you're helping other people learn to teach too, other people be excellent in their teaching. I know a lot of you do this. It's not a big deal to apply for it. You're basically showing us, what do you do to extend excellence of teaching at campus and beyond? And we'd love to recognize you either with our professional development certificate or as a fellow. And Ashley has just dropped that information into the chat if any of you would like to pursue that. And if any of you don't have invitation to our Canvas resources, let us know and we can add to that as well. All right, Tucker, I bought you some time, I think. Do we have any need to know events coming up?
Yes. So for our need to know events, we have 4 scheduled this semester. We've already had 2, one with Doris Carroll on microaggressions. The other one was with Ellie Sayre last week. Coming up, our event on March 24th with Rachel Levitt and Mitzi Farmer, that is designated a need to know event because of the importance of that topic. And then our final need to know event of the semester will be on April 21st when we have Dr. Cody Walls coming in and talking about just-in-time conversations on mental health, given that it's going to be a very stressful time of the semester for not only our students, but for us as well. And so she will be talking about the importance of resilience during that very critical time of the semester. But those are the 2 remaining need to know events that we have. Again, that's on March 24th and on April 21st.
So any questions about any of that information we just shared with you? All right, well, we are about out of time. I love the teaching chats. I love all of our events. I love the community of teachers we have at K-State. I love that we have people who will, even during a very long semester on a very dreary day, that we came to have a very awesome chat on teaching that probably could have gone 3 more hours, which is amazing. If anyone has anything compelling and wants to stay around for another couple seconds, I'll be here. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you next week.